Hey, how's it going, everybody? Welcome back to the Modern Mythology. This is sort of a podcast supplement. So, we have been lately talking about horror games, and we were actually able to talk about four. We ran through a couple little actual plays. Um, and but there are a lot of games that we were really not able to cover. Some old, um, and and some new. And so this was going to be an attempt for me to just cover some of the games that not only did we have plans to talk about and just didn't really get to, but also some of the games that really made a big impact on not only how I run horror games, but also on how I run games in general. Um, now, interestingly enough, one of the games that we're going to talk about is Call of Cthulhu. I don't have to show you because, um, to be honest, I sold it. I used to have every edition of Call of Cthulhu, and um, by and large, uh, I ultimately got rid of it. But there was a post recently. Shout out to the Mage of the Awakening podcast, and they were talking about unknown armies and varying different games that have sort of some esoteric abilities and magic and things like that. And so I thought this was a good time to talk about some of our honorable mentions, so to speak. Of course, if you listen to the podcast, we talk about Blades in the Dark, we talk about Don't Rest Your Head, Whispering Vault, and Chronicles of Darkness. Today, we're going to basically be talking about Call of Cthulhu and these three games. Now, Call of Cthulhu is by far the grandfather of horror games. Chill might actually be a little older, if I recall correctly. Call of Cthulhu came out in Call of Cthulhu came out in 1981, and Chill. Let's see here. Oh, this is really good podcasting, but I can't find the date on my chill book. That's crazy. All right. Uh, so yeah, but they're basically kind of neck and neck in terms of which one is older. They really both have a very similar vibe. Here's the chill character sheet. And you can see that, let's see here, we have stamina, willpower, insight, a lot of very similar stats, edges, drawbacks, and so on and so forth, right? But Call of Cthulhu, I haven't seen an edition of Chill in a very long time, but I have actually been running Call of Cthulhu for decades upon decades. However, one of the Mage the Awakening podcasts, one of their commenters was saying that they thought that because they were going to run Cult, somebody said that Unknown Armies and Call of Cthulhu had much better systems to run. Well, that is the surefire way for me to mobilize. uh, so if you haven't heard already, I'm sort of a system snob, and particularly in terms of horror games, because while Mage of the World of Darkness games probably has the least horror elements, um, uh, or sort of supernatural creepiness in terms of system, right? the others in our list were very high on our horror scale. Now, we're going to be having a horror wrap up episode that we're about to record. And so this is actually for my fellow hosts, as much as it is for you, where I'm going to look at the mechanics of these 4 games and just get a sense of what we're talking about in terms of system and how it informs role playing. Right? Now, let's just talk a little bit about Call of Cthulhu. Again, we don't have anything to show you here. But Call of Cthulhu, so first off, was originally developed in 1981, definitely the grandfather of these games. Greg Stafford, Steve Perrin, Sandy Peterson. Greg Stafford and Steve Perrin actually had developed the basic role play system during the early days of RuneQuest, which of course is the seminal sort of Glorantha setting. Again, a lot of this stuff I have in PDF at this point, and only have Hero Wars by Robin Laws. Love that game. And so, but really, after RuneQuest moved on, basic roleplay became Chaosium's in-house system, and of course, they moved into Call of Cthulhu. Call of Cthulhu is a skill-based system. In fact, it's really one of the first skill-based systems where it's a percentage die. You're trying to roll under your skill. They play with difficulties in terms of like halves and quarters of how difficult something is. So if you have a 60% chance of doing something, if it's really difficult, it might be a 30% chance. If it's even more difficult, it might only be 15% chance. So it's a percentage, right, of quarters, and so to speak, of your main stat. And as you move on in sort of the game system becomes a little bit more accessible, they learn a little bit more about development. It's had six editions thus far. Several of them are absolutely gorgeous books. They were able to have the character sheets split those out, so it's a little easier to manage. I also want to point out that Call of Cthulhu also happens to be one of the first, not only to have a sanity mechanic, right, which is critical to some sort of loss of agency, some sort of sense that your character has moved on, some way to honestly engage with, first attempts at engaging with the idea that what Lovecraftian heroes managed, where they basically just start losing their minds and becoming NPCs. But it also happens to be one of the first organic advancement systems out there. And if it weren't for something like Burning Wheel, very likely more of what I'd use. And how that works is that whenever you use a skill, you sort of make a little check mark at the end, and at the end you roll. If you roll under, then you learn something, and you maybe gain some, gain a couple points out of it. Interestingly enough, the game Unknown Armies pull something from that also, which we'll talk about later. Now, I want to also mention that that all of these games have a chock full of GM advice, Call of Cthulhu included, and of course the internet is, filled with possible games or possible techniques you can use to run a better game. Hey, like the Modern Mythology podcast, But what we're trying to talk about is seeing how system really engages with telling stories about horror. So, GM advice aside, right? This is how do your die rolls, how do your scene mechanics, how do these games explicitly cover much of what's going on and what we're talking about. So Call of Cthulhu, there's no particular piece in there. Now, I do want to mention that all of these games, most 90% of horror games have a very similar scene structure involved, sometimes implicit, sometimes explicit, you know, and we're just talking about horror tropes, right? Where you have your setup, you're seeing your characters doing something normal, sort of, establishing what normality is. You have the reveal, which is that first hint of something supernatural, something weird. Sometimes the characters engage with it, sometimes they don't. You have the investigation, where we now push further, more is revealed, we learn more about what's going on, we get some creepiness, we get some questions. Then you have the confrontation, right, where this is when something big happens, and very often somebody dies, somebody goes insane. This is where you're really starting to uncover and peel away the truth. You have climax. This is basically the big fight scene, the big explosion, the big running from the island. Basically some means to, this is, where you're going to engage with the throne of the bad guy, whatever your scenario might be. And then you have the denouement. In horror games, the denouement becomes very, very important, because now you're dealing with the after effects, what's going on, right? And so in Lovecraftian stories, you might find out that, so-and-so went to the hospital. You might find out that somebody, like a big cliffhanger where one of the PCs, still has something lingering in the back of his mind, or has nightmares and can't sleep. Maybe two characters meet at a cafe and they sort of talk a little bit about or the after effects or the not after effects. And of course, I would say most good horror very likely has some sort of like, yeah, you think you got away moment, but and so all of these kind of can deal with those ideas. But Call of Cthulhu doesn't have anything other than sanity. Sanity is the main piece. And if you look at the book, again, I apologize for not having it in front of me, but if you look at the book, you can see that there are dozens of pages on combat and dozens of pages on various maladies that your character can gain through loss of sanity. You definitely get the sense that this is the lion's share of the book. You have a fairly decent sized section of the kinds of characters you can play, what their skill sets and such would be. Most of the game is dominated by combat and dominated by this insanity section. Now, this makes sense, right? 1981, this is at the beginning of RPGs. This is where we're basically all looking at its sources, and that source has mostly been in wargaming, right? So these are people really starting to understand this concept. Now, I'm not trying to say that there weren't story games out there. There really were. There's some seminal works that we'll talk about later. But by and large, these are, quite honestly, diverging off of the level system, diverging into a skill-based system, by and large, was already sort of earth-shattering for the RPG community. Dread came out in about 2005. This is by Epidaya Ravikal. It's an amazing book. If you have not picked it up or never looked at it, I would highly suggest it. Now, a lot of these games, Call of Cthulhu kind of included, but these more than COC, really have a focus on playing a session or maybe a few sessions, particularly Cult and Dread. These are games where you need to let go of the idea that your character is going to survive. Now, Call of Cthulhu, we're going to talk at the podcast about troop style. A lot of these games, if you want a campaign going, very much can meet those needs, but often you're going to have ostensibly a stable, right, of characters. But one of the great things about Dread, so let's just take a look at Dread real quick. So Dread doesn't have a character sheet per se, and does not have stats. Your characters have what are called questionnaires, and those questionnaires basically sort of are means to be evocative and explain not only who your character is, but how these characters are involved in the scenario. So, for instance, if we were to say, character one, you have left someone behind that you visit every time you're in port. Who is it? Why can't they come along with you? You are placed aboard a ship as the technician because you specialize in what sort of drives. You suffered some sort of injury and now have cybernetic prosthetic. What do you miss most about having your original body part? Right? So the GM in developing a scenario is often tasked with coming up with these, and there's some advice on how to come up with a great questionnaire. But that's your character sheet, right? There's no numbers or anything to that effect. And so what happens is basically, very, very simply, when you come upon a serious situation, then you engage with the tower, right? And yep, there is the tower. So this is an amazing piece where, as you guys are playing, you're removing pieces, right? And you're going forward and just trying to, is that load bearing? Who knows? So your character might, I'm going to slowly open the door, and what do I see? Right? And can you feel as I pull? I'm facing my boyfriend, and he's shouting at me, and I want him desperately to stay. Did you feel that? Right? I don't know. Or how about the Bayaki leaves through a smaller window than its size? How do I feel about that? And I am stabbed by some crazed homeless man, right? And we continue. Now, interestingly enough, we continue, and you could see how the tension is rising throughout the narrative. The tension is rising throughout the narrative until eventually you may be like, well, this is an easy one. Here we go. I'm going to take this one here. And it's sort of up to the GM a little bit, right? Again, not part of the game, sort of up to the GM to know how to pace this out so that when, if, and absolutely when this kind of comes crumbling down, right? Then the not only is the character lost, that character basically goes away. It's lost its marbles, it dies, whatever the case is, and we reframe the scene very often in some sort of traumatic way. All right. So, and I will say that the Epidia really, takes a really hard look at the genre, and really gets a sense and is ramping up tension, is like really talking about that story structure, and for this game. So Dread, probably one of the top. I don't necessarily expect you, while you're, to change your mechanics and pull out a Jenga tower, but I would suggest maybe during a session, particularly stuff like Ravenloft, particularly stuff like Call of Cthulhu, where you have these maybe heightened sessions, like really important pieces, dramatic social interactions. This would be like a great social mechanic where you're at least part of the, like, how is this unraveling, right? And you might even get to a sense where you're saying, look, if you can do X number of pulls, right? Let's say 20 pulls, and you can pull that off, no pun intended, then you succeed. But if the tower crashes, then your goals for that scene might be a little wrought. This would be a good like ballroom scene, right? If you're having sort of you're dancing, you're trying to do etiquette, you're trying to just like a shaking it up a little bit mechanic. I know a buddy of mine, shout out to Rob Paul, who does LARPs using this. So you go and you're doing your role play, kind of parlor game sort of deal. And then next thing you know, you're like, oh, well, I want to do something important. Is it important enough to pull from the tower? So check out Dread. If you get an opportunity to, I would guess that Indie Press Revolution probably carries it. Obviously the internet, you could certainly find it and some of the games that are based on it. So let's talk about Unknown Armies. So Unknown Armies is actually 3 books in one. I'm not certain how I feel about this format. And I want to mention Unknown Armies has been around for a long time. 1998, Greg Stolze, John Tynes. The original version of these games, again, a little bit more traditional, more the setting. It had a pretty normal way of approaching things, but the setting was pretty crazy. You have, flesh and, sex and, and all this crazy, talking about, homeless people magic and talking about art magic and dream magic and so on and so forth. Now, this version of the game took quite a different turn. It has definitely a weirder tone. And while I definitely think this is probably more in the camp of horror than maybe even the original. And the original, of course, is coming off of almost a decade of Vampire, really starting to dominate some of the RPG scene. And so you're getting a sense of now you're not necessarily facing the horrors, but sometimes you are the horrors. Sometimes you're doing pretty grotesque, crazy stuff in order to cast magic. Run and play are basically the bread and butter of the game system. Reveal does one of the things that I love most, which is this is basically a setting book where it becomes a dictionary. And big shout out to one of my all-time favorite RPG settings. This is for probably the father of story gaming, Sorcerer. Ron Edwards and The Forge were just this giant catalyst machine of story games. And of course, kudos for Jennifer Rogers getting Luke Crane in all of his glory on the cover of Dictionary of Moo. And this is just such an amazing, evocative way to manage your setting, which is going through and having a dictionary, just like W, here's T, here's R. Sort of, I clearly mixed this up a bit as I've been using it, but I do this for 90% of my settings. Right? Oh, I was going backwards. That's what it was. Where you just have, instead of necessarily having all of these gazetteers of just, lists of sites and geographies and weather and so on and so forth, you start with just all this evocative information about the setting. A is for apex predator, L is for love, R is for restriction. It really does, reading through these allows you a very accessible way to engage with the setting. But we're not talking about setting. All these games have really amazing, interesting settings. Call of Cthulhu, Cult, Unknown Armies particularly. Dread is really a workbook, is really a set of tools. It doesn't have an implicit setting itself. So we're basically just going to look at two things. First, we're going to look at these crazy character sheets. Now, I will say, boy, this game is esoteric as fuck, okay? So buckle in, because when it comes to mechanics that are not intuitive, mechanics that are going to take a bit for you and your players to start to unpack and internalize, it takes a little bit more time for Unknown Armies than a lot of other games. Now, what we're looking at here is a dance, okay? This is a dance. This character sheet is a intertwined means of storytelling, and there's a lot going on. So these are called shock gauges. And whenever you're going to do anything, it really, 9 times out of 10, has less to do with like what you're doing as it does of like what's sort of the theme of what you're doing. And we've seen a lot of that in Powered by the Apocalypse. We've seen a lot of that in other games that are player focused to some degree. It has to do with like tags and things like that too. But basically what you're doing is you're saying, am I doing something fitness oriented? Am I doing something that has to do with status? Am I doing something that has to do with how connected I am with something, or what I notice, or how much knowledge do I have? Right? This is a percentage system, of course, with Greg Stolze. He's amazing at understanding how to play with dice a little bit. One of my absolute favorite games is Godlike. And of course, he also did this with Rain and a couple other games. It's a different system, but you should check it out. We'll probably talk about it at some point in time. And the idea here is that this first column is where you are fresh and innocent. These are called open gauges. And you could see that when you're fresh and innocent and trying to do these things, it's a little easier to do. This is ostensibly the best person you will be. But then as you fail rolls, you start moving down this track. And in fact, you're even going to start the game with some of these. You describe things that have been revealed to you, that you've seen. And certainly characters who have not really been exposed to the supernatural, exposed to sort of some of the weirdness, will be fresher in certain things than others. You'll also notice that you have failures. These are all bad, basically, and you don't want to get failures, right? And when you do, it says defend status attacks with connect. So there's connect. Defend connect attacks with status. Defend notice attacks with knowledge. Notice attacks with knowledge, and defend knowledge attacks with secrecy. There's secrecy, and then defend fitness attacks with struggle. And there's where's struggle? There's struggle. So there's a interesting, like, bad things happen whenever you have failures. These start going down. These top numbers go down, but then you could see that these are called hardened gauges. So it's open gauges and hardened gauges. And you can see as you're moving forward, you're getting better at certain things. You know, your fitness may be going down, but your dodge is going up. Your knowledge is going down, but your understanding of deception is going up. Your connections are going down, but your struggle, your ability to withstand adversity is going up, and so on and so forth. So it's a really interesting dichotomy going on here. Now, of course, not everything has to be about these pushes. Everything doesn't have to be about your reactions to things. A lot of times it's just what do I know? A lot of times it could be like, do I have any sort of intimate knowledge or skill? I want to pick a lock. How am I going to pick a lock? Well, it's a little more opaque doing this stuff, and that's when you have identities. Identities, you start with at least one identity, I believe, and they start very low. This, again, is an organic. We talked about the COC organic advancement system. This is also an organic system where the first failure you get an identity, you check it off, and then that identity goes up about like 1 to 5%. At the end of the session. Also, this is an objective-based game, and this is a really important part of all of this. Now, here is your horror, right? Here is ostensibly your sanity loss and things like that. But objectives, this is baked into the game, where how you do and how you sometimes affect some of these. Like your failures, every scene has to do with a character objective. Whatever those objectives are, then are directly tied into these, and also can be directly tied into identity. So for instance, if you want to learn new spells, if you want to if you no longer feel like your hard-bitten detective is a hard-bitten detective, he's moving more into, say, an archivist, you talk to the group and say, look, I would like this part of this game to be more about this archivist. I want part of this game to be more about maybe me as a mother, and things like that. And you can start building on identities. You also have more mundane identities, and you have more esoteric and powerful identities, where that can be part of the game as well. And so you can see this is a game that just, all of this stuff is just an engine for story, right? The GM doesn't have to come up with tricks, doesn't have to come up with ways to plug into the story. This whole piece ends up being the story. Takes a little bit to get into. I do not suggest just doing one-shots in this. Quite honestly, I feel like most groups probably have to do like 3 sessions of Unknown Armies. And then once you get there, sometimes it's just really not enough, right? So that's what's going on in that. Now, Cult. So Cult's a really, really interesting game. And it's also had its beginnings, actually, even before Unknown Armies, 1993. And this game probably, Unknown Armies really did have a very significant shift, right, that we talked about in its approach. Cult recently had an even bigger shift, in my opinion. We went through from a fairly standard way of approaching game. You do have family, friends, income, personality, right? You have some stats. You see those, initiative, damage bonuses, right? And then as you go here, look at that list of skills, right? Weapons, equipment, armor. A really very traditional way of approaching these games. This was developed by Niels Gullikson, Gunilla Johnson, and Michael Peterson, 1993. And I've actually been playing this game since then, for a long time. But then in 2018, they had a Kickstarter. Really changed the way this game is approached. Like Unknown Armies, the basics of the game really didn't change in terms of this game is less about, there we go, that's better. This game is less about external factors that exist in the real world and become more about the world is not what you think it is. It's really about peeling back. This is much more in terms of your perception was wrong and here's what the world really looks like, where stuff like Call of Cthulhu, Unknown Armies, and a lot of other horror games are about, the World of Darkness, are about what exists in the world that you just haven't noticed or is hidden for you. Where this is now a much different perspective. First off, I will say this book is absolutely gorgeous. It's the creep factor is there. The look at just amazing art. I am very much hoping to be able to talk to some of the creators. Actually, one of the editors, Jacqueline Brick, might be able to chat with us. Maybe we'll even get her to run a game or be part of a game. And we've had several podcasts that we've listened to that run through and talk about Cult, right? And just absolutely gorgeous book. This game lives and dies. It is a Powered by the Apocalypse game, and certainly call out to Vincent Baker for creating this rich tapestry of ways to approach games, which I absolutely love. Unlike Powered by the Apocalypse, this uses a 2d10 instead of a 2d6 system. And so while Call of Cthulhu, just an example, a lot of traditional games, what happens is you have a number in a skill. Again, it becomes more simulationist, right? You're walking through a world, and how can you have success or failure? But of course, the true magic of anything Powered by the Apocalypse ends up being these mixed successes. So you could see, if we're going to do anything, let's look at something. So see through the illusion. This is activated when you suffer shock, injury, or distort your perception through drugs or rituals. Means the PC seeing through the illusion can happen when terrible things happen to you. Right? You have normal, investigate, observe a situation. And in all of these, what's going to end up happening is you either have a strong success, you have a mixed success, or you have a failure. And then the GM can use moves. And all of these games, by the way, you'll notice Dread, Unknown Armies, and Cult. The GM never rolls, right? The GM never rolls. So Engage in Combat is a really excellent example. So what do you have here? You have when you engage or able opponent in combat explains how you roll plus violence. Yes, violence is a stat. 15 plus, you inflict damage on your opponent and avoid counterattacks. Great, you did wonderfully. 10 to 14, you inflict damage, but at a cost. The GM chooses you're either subjected to counterattacks, you do less damage than intended, you lose something important. That's sort of like attrition in Crown and Skull. You expand all your ammo. You're beset by a new threat. A new threat comes in. You'll be in trouble later on. Maybe a lot of these are something notices you, right? One of these I noticed, act under pressure. And then here is sort of like an interesting encapsulated sort of sanity mechanic, right? Where you roll willpower when you exercise self-control to keep from succumbing to stress, traumatic experiences, or psychic influence. Roll willpower. You grit your teeth and stay the course. The effort to resist instills a condition where it remains with you. And you choose an effect, including loss in a stat called stability. Right, this is like one of the largest pieces that you pull through. Now, granted, keep in mind that a lot of this, while it is dictated and it very much pushes story forward, a lot of GMs empowered by the apocalypse really understand this sort of implicit idea that GMs now have moves. You have soft moves, you have hard moves, and then what you're doing is the character roles. They say what they're trying to do. You determine what stat or is available between their passive stats and active stats, and there's while these have specific headings, keep it together, endure, act under pressure, engage in combat, read a person, observe a situation, see through the illusion, investigate, help, or hinder. While those are prescriptive, you definitely get a sense of success is whatever the PC is looking for. Often the PC is going to narrate or is going to ask the GM, questions that the GM answers honestly. You have mixed successes where they get some of what they want and not all of. There's some yes and going on here. There's some, additional threats that the GM can throw in there. There's the sense of maybe like, both parties get damage. You move forward a little bit, but the bad guys move forward as well. And then failures in general. So, this sort of thing, just this structure alone moves stories forward, right? And while a lot of traditional games, I'll add partial successes in there, these kinds of games really, there's lots of, here's the characters, they're based on, Jamie would like this, they're based on what are called archetypes. And you have a number of different archetypes. Everybody has dark secrets, disadvantages, and advantages. All this can be in basically like one setup. Everybody's terribly broken. They have a lot of scenarios in here, and those scenarios that are baked in very often are like one shots, are very, but we've definitely, not with the new one, but with the old one, have definitely done these crazy esoteric campaigns, so good stuff. Definitely not for children. Unknown Armies, same thing. But there you have it. So, I think of all of these games, Dread probably has, I think using questionnaires in the beginning of a game is actually really powerful. It's something I'm going to be doing with my D&D game. Of course, objectives. I use objectives, goals, character arcs, beliefs, whatever you want to call them. Some means to sort of push the players forward, allow them to be proactive in your games, and then now you're just understanding and setting up obstacles for that. This definitely allows you to sort of like progress through a game by those percentages, right? So your objective might start at a 50% in unknown armies, and those, whether or not you sort of abandon an objective becomes narrative, but also you're like, oh, I'm so far away. Let's start something new. Maybe you have a break, and that break says, this isn't worth going on. It's a little harder to pull in techniques from Cult if you ever wanted to, or any Powered by the Apocalypse piece, other than to say, first off, I would suggest looking at, I'm going to be doing this with my D&D game, using partial successes is a big deal, and also turning those roles into just being player-focused roles, right? If you we'll talk about that later on, but that's it. I might do a second follow-up to this where I show you what a similar scenario would be running each of these games, Call of Cthulhu included, without GM, like, cult of personality, without a GM just being spooky and having great voices and knowing how to do pacing. Just simple outcomes and like how it feels when you play those games. We'll see if I can get that done, but so maybe look out for that. In the meantime, please check us out, modernmythology.net, as we wrap up our series about episode 7 or 8. We wrap up our series on horror and we start looking at the cyberpunk genre. Hey, thanks for joining the conversation.